So, Dominique, I'm guessing you remember the Ask Jeeves search engine, right? And I'm guessing you remember what the famous Jeeves used to say, which I posed to you today on this episode of Ctrl-Alt-Speech, which is have a question, ask.
I am old enough to know and remember Jeeves, Ben. And my question to you is, how many goals are we scoring on Sunday?
Yes, a fellow England fan.
Yes.
Football's coming home.
Are we going to get a bank holiday if it comes home?
That's the other question. I really, really hope so. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. This week's episode is brought to you with the financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation, and I'm joined this week by a fellow football/soccer fan, Domonique Rai-Varming, who is a change of co-host on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, but is a very welcome one. Domonique, very much welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm well, thank you. I'm very well.
Very exciting to have you here. So just by way of introduction, Domonique is a Senior Director of Trust and Safety at Trustpilot. Domonique reached out when we issued a call for co-hosts and guests a few weeks back, which we were delighted by. She's exactly the kind of person we wanted on the podcast, and she brings a wealth of experience. Domonique, talk us about your role at Trustpilot, what Trustpilot does, for those who don't know, and why you decided to put your hand up to be a co-host of Ctrl-Alt-Speech.
I can take that last question first and put it down to a moment of madness. Here we are.
Regretting it now, are you?
We'll see. But thank you for having me to start with. Let me tell you what Trustpilot is, what we do. So Trustpilot's an open and independent reviews platform, which is free to use and open to everybody. The key requirement being that reviews must be based on somebody's genuine experience with a business. And so our proposition is that we're here to help businesses build trust, grow, and improve their services by listening to their customers. So businesses that use our platform get a deeper understanding of what their customers are saying through positive and negative reviews. And consumers can write reviews of any business they want, whether they're on our platform or not. As I said before, reviews have to be based on a genuine experience, and consumers have the benefit of learning from their peers and other consumers about where to buy from, where to have an experience, that sort of thing. Our mission is to be a universal symbol of trust for businesses and consumers. And so we see our platform as a place to increase trust between businesses and consumers.
I'm a big fan of Trustpilot, I have to say. I go to Trustpilot, and I'm not saying this just because you're here, but
Okay.
I go to Trustpilot whenever I'm kind of having a service brought in, when I'm ordering stuff. It's a big bonus if a service has a high Trustpilot score, which is great. And you have a really interesting background that kind of brought you to the trust and safety world, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I'd be really glad to. So I'm actually a lawyer by trade. I think actually meeting more and more people within the TNS space is there's no one bio to fit the trust and safety mold. So I'm a litigator by background. I was working for city law firms for 10 years and then actually had a change of lifestyle in 2019. Post-Brexit, I moved to Copenhagen and stumbled upon our old chief trust officer at Trustpilot and ended up being at Trustpilot. I started as a legal counsel, so managing all of Trustpilot's litigation work, which completely suited my background. And actually what I learned pretty quickly was that content was at the core of all of the disputes that we face at Trustpilot, and it continues to be. Fast forward a number of years now, I think almost 5, and as you say, Ben, I'm the Senior Director of Trust and Safety. And what does that mean? So our trust and safety flywheel and structure is made up of a number of teams and a number of multidisciplinary teams. We have fraud analysts, fraud investigators, policy and content creation team, a disputes team, a content moderation team, and a public affairs and corporate comms team. So the way that works is public affairs are out trying to influence and shape the direction of legislation, which then gets rolled into our product and our policy. So the policy should capture the reg. And then that's moderated through our content moderation arm. So it's a really neat flywheel, a very intentional and neat flywheel, which is
Yeah, really,
well.
Really interesting to hear a bit about how you're structured internally and organized. You mentioned before we kind of started today's call about this reviews coalition as well, which Mike and I have talked about actually on a previous episode,
Mm.
where Trustpilot and a few other review sites have got together to share learnings. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and just kind of how that came about and what that involves?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think what we've all noticed over the last couple of years is that this landscape that we're all operating in is evolving, and it's evolving really quickly, whether that be through consultations, legislation. There's a lot happening in different geos as well that's not always linked. And so, as platforms, you mentioned the coalition that we've co founded along with Amazon, Booking, TripAdvisor, Expedia, and Glassdoor with a coalition for trusted reviews. We came together through sort of identifying commonalities, and we've been working together for the last sort of 18 months now. There are a number of other sort of coalitions and industry groups, but our focus is trusted reviews. And what are we doing? We've come together to try and establish best practices for the industry. You know, a difficulty we found with that perhaps regulators and enforcement bodies are trying to grapple with is what's a fake review? There's no one definition of what a fake review is. And we're, sort of answering different consultations in different ways because the question is different. But actually, there's a lot of power in us coming together as an industry and sort of working together to set that definition. So we're trying to establish a working definition, best practices. We've done this. We're also trying to work together more in the enforcement space. So, a fake review on Trustpilot is bad for not just Trustpilot, but for the whole reviews industry.
Mm.
And what we weren't doing before was sharing information between platforms. And so that's something else that we're trying to do, because our biggest threat is review brokers, review sellers.
Right.
And they don't really operate just on one of our platforms. They tend to operate on all of our platforms. And so
fascinating.
actually sharing insights is another arm of what we're doing. And the final arm is sort of advocacy. So the plan is that, hopefully in time, we can advocate together as a voice.
Brilliant. That's great to hear. And, there's many similar alliances that have sprung up over the last few years where companies, platforms of a similar ilk have got together to share learnings. And it's great to see the reviews group and platforms do the same. We're really lucky to have you here, Dominique. I'm super excited to bring some of your experience to bear on some of the stories that have been coming out this week. We have a really interesting selection, and we're going to kick off with a breaking news story by many accounts, a story that just as I was hitting send on Everything in Moderation today was announced by the EU. And that is the fact that the EU Commission has charged Elon Musk's X/Twitter platform for a number of breaches of the DSA. So I was prepared before we kind of jumped on the call to talk a bit about how the EU it's had a busy week, right? It's sought information out from Amazon about some of its recommender systems. It's announced the 25th VLOP, a porn site called XNXX, very catchy name. So it's already had a very busy week. And then all of a sudden, it puts out this press release saying that there are several breaches of the DSA after a 7-month investigation. And X has basically become the first platform to fall foul of the DSA, which is a big story, something Mike and I have talked a lot about in previous weeks. When was the DSA going to bring proceedings against a platform? There are a few parts of it that we'll go into in a second, and I'll break down a bit of that. But what was your reaction as soon as you heard about this story, Dominique? What came to mind?
What came to mind? Not surprise is, I think, what I would say. Not surprise.
Agreed. Basically, it always felt like Twitter was going to be the first, right? Back in December, it was last year, Thierry Breton had gone after Elon Musk and made this big fanfare about the fact that Twitter hadn't complied with the DSA. And so it made a lot of sense that it was the first platform for the investigation to be announced. And yeah, I'm not surprised either. There's been a kind of long-standing beef between the European Commission and Twitter, as we'll go into. And there's a few things that kind of are worth flagging just about the EU Commission's announcement today. They're basically kind of, the breach is in 3 parts. The first part is that the X/Twitter has been found to breach its clause on dark patterns. And here the EU has found that the verification of Twitter users is basically misleading. And since Twitter has changed the way that verification worked. And obviously, the blue check stopped being something for dignitaries and politicians and became something that anybody could buy. The EU believes that that is a breach of what calls its dark patterns piece of the legislation. It's also fallen foul of two other parts of the DSA: ad transparency and also data access for researchers, which is something that we know has been known for a long time now, that Twitter has rolled back on in recent years. And we don't have much more information than that. There's a really interesting quote from Thierry Breton, who is very kind of punchy in his commission's new investigation. He's very proud, I think, by the sounds of it, to kind of bring this to bear. And yeah, this is one of 4 investigations that the EU has had in the process so far. We've still got 3 outstanding on AliExpress, Meta, and also TikTok as well, for various different potential breaches. So we're in DSA enforcement now. Dominique, what's your kind of feeling on the DSA? How has Trustpilot viewed the legislation since it became law? Talk to me about kind of your dealings with it.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think the starting point for me and for us as a platform is, let's think about what this legislation is there to address. I think it can sometimes get lost in the headlines and sort of the enforcement. But I don't think anybody can argue against the purpose of the DSA. We all agree that protecting everybody online has to be priority number one. Nobody can argue that. And it's really important to keep that in mind and to keep that focus rather than focusing on perhaps what's going wrong with the legislation or what might be wrong with the legislation. I think from sort of my thinking is, this is a punchy piece of legislation by the EU. It's flagship. Let's not forget that. They're the first to sort of dabble into trying, well, it's not really dabbling, it's a bit more than dabbling, but they're the first to take decisive action in dealing with this sort of content. The EU have been really ambitious with the DSA, and this sort of outcome on Twitter, on X, sorry, is definitely a key moment for this piece of legislation. Perhaps now, this has happened. My sense is that we've all just sort of become compliant, or we're working towards becoming compliant with the DSA. The legislation really needs time to sort of bed in a little bit and to see where it may or may not bite. I can say that from a position of relative comfort for now, as Trustpilot's not a VLOP yet. And so we're almost a passenger for now. But it's a really interesting development.
Yeah. So talk about the kind of work you've had to do to ensure that Trustpilot complies with the DSA, even at a kind of lower level.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it was very much touted from several years ago, really. You knew it was coming. There was a deadline set of February for everyone. And talk us through kind of what you and your teams have had to do to make sure that you're compliant.
Yeah, we've been involved with the DSA for a very long time. As you said, Ben, they've been consulting on it for many years. It's been through many rounds of drafts. And so we were involved in the consultations at an early stage. And from our perspective, it was really important for us to explain and to communicate to the regulator how a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. As I said before, we're not a VLOP, and there needs to be nuance to these sorts of legislations, because there are smaller platforms, there are marketplaces which are different to social media. We all have a different role to play, and actually the harms that each platform poses or could be faced with is different. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so, of course, we've known it's been coming for a long time. We've been involved in consultations. And then once we knew the shape of it, the starting point for us was building the story to the business around what this is about and why it's important. And as I said before, that's something that can get lost sometimes, particularly if in a world where there's so much legislation coming down the line, you want to avoid that feeling of creating a compliance culture. And so the storytelling piece has been important for us, right? We are part of this online safety ecosystem. The DSA is there to protect everybody, in particular children, vulnerable users, from egregious, horrible, harmful content. That's really important. It was really important to tell that story and to explain to our colleagues across the business the really important that we all play in enforcing that.
Yeah, you forget in some ways that when something like the DSA comes along, not everybody is so in the weeds of it as maybe, we are.
Yeah.
And so this idea of kind of going around a business and talking people through why it's important and what it might mean for them is super interesting. What did that mean in practice? Because I'm sure there are Ctrl-Alt-Speech listeners who will be thinking about compliance with the DSA and other legislation like it. What did that actually mean in practice? Like, what did you do? You kind of like knocking on people's doors, setting up meetings, offering, I don't know, cookies as bribes.
I'd say an element of all of the above, Ben. So of course the storytelling piece was really important to set the seeds. And then what did that mean? The way we operate is all of this is run through our trust and safety team. And so we assembled a core team who would be running the project. So a core team made up of our policy and regulatory lawyers. It was lawyers who actually ran the implementation predominantly
Okay.
once it had got past, draft legislation stage. And it was literally a case of line by line going through what would apply, what wouldn't apply, mapping that against our existing product infrastructure. So what do we do today? Identifying really quickly, actually, what may need to change. So big product changes, comms changes from our content moderators, the reasoning for our decision making had to be tweaked to account for the requirements of the DSA. There was obviously a lot more to it than that. And it was a project that spanned about 18 months, actually. And we only recently got our API key because there were many delays in sort of handing those out. So yeah, it's an ongoing project, and it's obviously something, there's an ongoing maintenance associated with it. So it's been a long journey and a continuing journey.
Yeah, this kind of compliance piece never really ends, does it? Really interesting to hear about that. I mean, from Twitter's perspective, from X's perspective, and don't worry, I also never used the new title of Twitter. But there's potentially massive fines at stake. I think that's what's really interesting, right? The DSA could bring about a 6% fine on global turnover. So, although Twitter's turnover last year was 20 odd percent down on the year before by virtue of actions of its new owner and advertisers' reaction to those, it's still, you made $3.2 billion last year. So 6% of that is north of $200 million. So it's a big fine that's potentially at stake. Do you think these kind of fines are sufficiently prohibitive for companies to make them take safety seriously? Do you think it kind of gets them in the right frame of mind to address some of the issues that would have been coming up in this investigation?
I think actually the level of fines and the way that these new pieces of legislation are being structured, sort of since GDPR to where we are now, and I don't imagine that this way of enforcing or regulating is going to change. I mean, it certainly sets a tone, doesn't it? Is it the right way necessarily? I don't know. I mean, going back to the purpose of the legislation, it really feels to me that the purpose of the legislation and what it's there to do should be at the fore of driving compliance, but appreciate that we live in a capitalist world where, money has lots of power. So appreciate there's a balance to be struck there.
Yeah, indeed. And the next steps as far as this story concerned, and it won't be the last investigation the EU bring, but for as far as X and Twitter are concerned, they now have a window of time where they can defend itself against these breaches, and they can propose updates to the product and to its work to try and address some of the concerns that the EU has brought to them. How it does that is going to be really interesting because, as we know, its trust and safety team have been really cut very deeply. We heard from the Australian E-Safety Commission a few months back that it had been chopped by a third after Elon Musk came in. So the number of people there able to do this work is far fewer. So will be really interesting to see how this plays out. And I think everyone have their popcorn at the ready to see how Musk responds. But thanks very much, Dominique. That's a really interesting take from you. We'll move on now to our next story, which is, again, related to something that Dominique and I care about as two Brits. It's not football, but it is the general election that's taken place recently here in the UK. And Dominique, this is something that you'd seen and been tracking really through the election process, right? You've been keeping an eye on politicians and AI fakes.
Yes, definitely. So, Ben, this is an article that was in The Guardian. It's about a week or so old now, but the story is this. There were several high-profile British female politicians, Angela Rayner, Penny Mordaunt, Gillian Keegan, naming a few, who'd been targeted by deep fake pornography sites. So websites that were using their images, digitally altering their images to create explicit content, obviously without their consent. Now, this is This is difficult and challenging and awful in many ways. It's malicious, but it speaks to a broader trend of cyber harassment against public figures, especially women.
Mm-hmm.
At the time this article was written, there had been some of these images circulating, and the fear 2 weeks ago was that perhaps there would be more of this, that could impact the election. I think luckily what we've seen now post-election is that actually this didn't happen en masse as expected. But what it's kept on the agenda, actually going into this new government, is the need for more governance around deepfake and harmful content. And we know that this was something that featured quite heavily and significantly in the Labour manifesto. And so what I'm interested in actually is seeing how this comes out in the King's Speech, which I think is coming soon.
Yeah, talk more about the King's Speech for people who don't necessarily know about the kind of weird oddities of the process. It's a kind of big deal, isn't it, in terms of setting the tone for the next 5 years, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
royal pageantry is not my thing either.
it's not my thing either.
We know that. I definitely think you're right about Labour's commitment to online safety, and they did make a big deal in their campaign about building on the Online Safety Act, which obviously is the UK's kind of major piece of legislation, which took an awful long time under the previous government to come to pass and was kind of shoehorned into the early part of this year. It's kind of talked about bringing forward provisions as soon as possible. It hasn't really gone into more detail than that. But obviously, we know that Ofcom has been doing an awful lot of work behind the scenes to create guidance and guides to, allow people like you on the platform side, on the intermediary side, to kind of figure out what changes it needs to make, as you discussed. So, yeah, I think we're probably going to see a further commitment to the Online Safety Act. There are obviously natural concerns from civil society and other organizations about whether this is going to have impingements on privacy and people's data rights and et cetera, et cetera. So, but for now, I think the fact that women weren't as affected as we possibly thought during the election with regards to AI fakes is a good thing. But the question I always have, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on here, is like, does it need to be widespread for it to be a problem? The fact that individual MPs and women are being targeted in this way, to what extent should we really zoom in on these individuals who are causing this harm? It's a challenge, isn't it? Individual harm versus kind of widespread harm is something that platforms are having to constantly juggle.
Absolutely, Ben. And it's sort of dealing with the individual harms could be taken, on the one hand, you could see that as a needle in a haystack, but then actually the impact of that harm could be huge. And there's a balance again to be struck between where responsibility should lie and where focus should be. But actually, I think with the technology that we've almost got at our fingertips in many respects, there's an opportunity there to deal with it all, irrespective of the scale. So it's about identifying and finding the right way and the most balanced way forward.
Yeah. At Trustpilot, is there ways that you're able to kind of zoom in on individuals who use tools and technology to create the fake reviews? How are you able to kind of discern that? Where do you actually kind of find the perpetrators? Is there a process for that?
It's a good question, Ben, about how we detect fake reviews. And there's a number of ways in which we do that. Technology, of course, plays a massive part in that. So for a number of years, we've been using machine learning and different tools to identify fake reviews and to look for fake reviews. So we're looking at behavior trends and patterns, and we can build pretty high. We have quite high confidence levels in the technology, but we also rely on our people and the people within our community, be that businesses, be that consumers, reviewers. They have the ability to flag reviews to us and to let us know, if something looks suspicious or harmful or obscene. There are mechanisms in place for dealing with sort of things through both of those lenses.
Great. This is something that I think is hopefully an isolated thing, really. We don't see the pervasiveness of politicians being targeted in this way. But with the US election coming up, I don't know if that's actually realistic. I am sure there'll be more to this. But yeah, thank you for talking through this. And we managed to get through the election segment without declaring whether we were happy or not about the results. So congratulations to us. Or leave listeners to work out how we voted. Great stuff. So we'll move on now to a series of other stories that Domonique and I have flagged and talked about in advance of today's episode. We'll start with a really interesting new research project that has launched this week called the Data Workers Inquiry. Now, you might not have heard much about this. I'm really excited by some of what's come out of it so far. Essentially, it's a new community research project run by a number of partners in Germany and elsewhere, including the Data AI Research Institute run by Timnit Gebru. And the project is essentially foregrounding the experiences of data workers, including data labelers and content moderators. And so this is a really interesting long-term research project where they have brought in 15 people who've worked as content moderators and labelers in various countries, and they're using their experience to guide the research. So they're getting them to kind of figure out what it is that is interesting about labor rights and data rights and the nature of this kind of work. And they're basically allowing them to do their own research into a whole number of different inquiries, which they term them on their website. And so this is people working in Venezuela, in Syria. It's people who've done data work in Kenya and in Germany as well, a real mixture of people. And through different means, they're bringing this experience to bear. So they're producing videos and podcasts. One of the data workers is producing a zine, which is available on the website. And the Data Workers Inquiry did a virtual event this week, which I listened into, which was really interesting. And they've got a series of webinars over the course of the next 6 to 8 months. Would really recommend kind of checking it out. I've been covering data work and content moderations who are working on the front line in countries outside of the kind of big English-speaking Western countries for a long time. And there's a number of really clear examples of where these moderators have not been allowed to unionize and not been given mental health support and have basically not been able to organize and fight for their very important rights. So fascinated by this research project. Hopefully, we'll be able to bring some of the folks from the Data Workers Inquiry onto the podcast at some point in the future. What did you think of this, Dominique? Are you kind of interested in hearing from this group of workers who obviously, unbeknownst to us, are helping refine the models that help keep people safe online all the time?
Yeah, I mean, Ben, I actually hadn't heard of this story, so thank you for sharing this one. And I read it with interest, actually. It was something that I actually hadn't thought about at all. It almost, and upon reading it, it made me think of sweatshops. We used to talk about factory sweatshops for making cheap clothes.
Mm.
And it feels like this is essentially what's happening here without us sort of even thinking about it. Well, I wasn't thinking about it or realizing. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that I'd love to know more, and it's obviously really important and crucial to ensure that there's proper ethical principles in place to A, guide AI development, but B, also look after all workers, whether they are at OpenAI or whether they are sort of where this is sort of looking, the workers, the data inputters in Kenya, Venezuela, and Syria.
Yeah.
It seems so important.
Yeah, agreed. And, the idea of being a refugee in a camp in Syria doing data labeling is something you can't really capture in a traditional research project. A typical research paper would reduce, I guess, those experiences down to a few quotes.
Yeah.
If you got quoted in a news story, or you maybe would get one or two quotes. But what's fascinating here is that these folks are being encouraged to really unpack their experience through a number of really creative means, and I'm excited to kind of dig deeper into it and see what they produce, really, because I'm hoping this gets picked up by the media. I'm hoping this gets picked up by politicians at various levels who start to understand the kind of trauma that is sometimes involved in sitting on queues for a long time and hitting yes and no on various bits of content, applying policy at scale. They're all really difficult things to do. I guess Trustpilot have moderators. You talked a bit about it at the top of the episode. How do you kind of work with that team to ensure that they're applying policy, that they're looked after? Do you have processes in place for that?
Yeah, yes, we absolutely do. I think I can distinguish the sort of types of content that our moderators see from other platforms where we don't host video, we don't host images. And so actually the harmful content that this story can speak more deeply to isn't something that necessarily applies to Trustpilot today.
Yeah.
But in terms of how our moderation team work, they sit within our trust and safety org. So they're very close to knowing we see them more as like trust and safety professionals, right? Not content moderators
Mm.
necessarily, which I think is maybe an older term now. But, they're trust and safety experts. They know what's going on in the legislative space. They know what's coming down the line. We're a tight team. They are involved in helping us frame policy and identifying, okay, if that happens, if the OSA is going to require this on us, we'll need to change these 3 policies and these 5 email macros that we send. So
Mm.
they're always in the loop and very involved in all of our processes.
That's interesting. So even though they're kind of content moderators in, like you say, this old term, and they are working at a kind of more elevated level than perhaps lots of people are used to. They're inputting on TNS strategy in a way, and that's a fascinating trend that we're seeing. I think where the humans who are involved in content moderation, they are increasingly kind of experts on regulation, on applying policy, and
Yeah.
enforcing and setting up operational systems to do that in a way that probably 5, 6, 7 years ago they weren't, or there was few of them that were able to do that. We're seeing a real, I guess, professionalization of the whole industry, particularly those folks who were doing some of the most difficult work at the bottom.
I think that's right, Ben. And I think there is, of course, a ticket work element to it still, which is really important because that's the stuff that needs to get done. But it's not a one and done approach for us. It's that bigger flywheel piece. And with the incorporation, as we're starting to think about using technology more, for example, that reinforces the need for our people, our moderators, our superheroes, actually,
Mm,
to be really sharp on policy and be the subject matter experts to guide what we'll be doing in the future.
yeah. Okay, cool. That is great. That's a really interesting research piece that we've covered there. We'll move on now to a similar story in many ways, a case study actually that you found, Dominique, about machine learning and human rights. And this is something that the Trust and Safety Foundation have published very recently. You actually, I think, have been in touch with the author, which is a helpful thing in this case. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting case study that I came across this week, which was written by Alan Kyle. It's about machine learning and how that can undermine human rights. And it's the focus and the platform that it's honing in on is YouTube and how they used AI to moderate the Syria crisis back in 2011. So the backdrop to this was that obviously the civil war broke out in 2011, and part of the suppression at the time was around free speech, and citizens and journalists were being persecuted because of their online activity, right? And on the ground, this online information was really important. It was really important that it be uploaded to internet platforms, and it helped provide sort of really valuable information to human rights investigators. It was essential.
Mm.
So evidence was uploaded to social media platforms, including YouTube, to try and build human rights defense cases or prosecution cases.
Hmm.
And what happened was that lots of machine learning tools were used to moderate the content. And let's remember, I think it's important to remember that this was a number of years ago, right? So perhaps the models weren't as sophisticated as they are today.
Yeah.
But given there was so much content that was going through classifiers, what we found, or what this paper has found with the benefit of hindsight, is that the sheer volume of the content and the limited contextual information, which we now know is really important when it comes to prompt engineering, and things like resource constraints. So you've got volume, context, complicated context, resource constraint,
Mm.
made it really difficult for the models to make the right decisions.
So I think this is a really interesting case study for a number of reasons. So I think the fact that you're right, this is 7 years ago now,
Mm.
basically, since YouTube introduced this new classification system and applied it to videos in Syria, means that it's a warning in many senses of how relying too much on technology can bring about over suppression of speech.
Yeah,
That's really the takeaway from this research and from this case study.
yeah,
It's a reminder that actually, even though platforms are kind of working in their best interest, and this was something that was a kind of reaction to obviously what was a very difficult story, difficult event, and kind of involved some, I think, political pressure to address the speech on the platform. Actually, there are downsides to rolling out classifiers like this without the right testing, without the right kind of red teaming, really. I would hope that it's different now, as you say. I would hope that the models and the kind of sophistication of the work being done on platforms is much better. But it's a warning in a way, isn't it? It's kind of, we are at risk of perhaps doing this again, maybe at a different scale. And we know in conflicts like Gaza and Israel, and elsewhere in Ukraine, where this is still a problem. People's posts, people's captions, people's images being hidden, being shadow banned, to use the term that many people use, again, through means that they are unclear about because of the classifiers on the platforms.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. I agree with you, Ben. I think it's really important. It's difficult to strike the right balance, right? I mean, the technology that we've got at our fingertips is so powerful and has such huge capability, which is exciting and of course can be really, really attractive to platforms, to businesses, right? The opportunity, thinking of this case, one of the issues that came up was resource constraints, right? If they didn't use tech, they would have needed, I don't know, thousands of additional people to review all of the content. And so the opportunity that comes with using technology in this way is ripe. But I think that with that use rightly comes responsibility. And I think for me, what we've learned from this case study and from some of the other news that's been out this week is that it's really important that we always have humans in the loop. And I think for content moderation generally, it feels like we're entering a new era in content moderation. And our moderators are almost our superheroes on the front line, protecting us all from this sort of content and engaging with context and nuance that would take a model a lot longer to catch up on.
Yeah.
And I think what also came out quite strongly from this research paper was the importance around building trust in AI use. We've come a long way this year with AI governance. I mean, it's not all the way there yet, but the importance of transparency. I don't think it was clear in this use case whether decisions were being made by classifiers, and we now know best practices. We need to be transparent when AI is making decisions. And explainability, we need to bring the general public along with us in this AI use journey and educating the general public around how decisions are being made and whether they're being made by machines or people.
Yeah, and you're right. And it's the other thing I think is the access to data for researchers to be able to do this work as well. Like Alan Carr could only really do a kind of case study like this and do research like this because he was able to get access to data. We talked at the top of the episode about the DSA coming for Twitter because of a lack of access to data and for researchers. So even 7 years on, it's a really helpful thing to note and to recognize that the classifiers performed poorly and suppressed speech in a way that hampered human rights investigations issues. I think that's a massive thing. We need to kind of keep a long lens and a long view on some of these questions because they will take a bunch of time to research and for academics to dig into and figure out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Agree.
Super. Okay, so let's move on to probably our last story today, which is, I think, a really interesting one because we've got a policy expert on the podcast today. It's a story, again, that's been kind of moving in the background for the last couple of weeks, but is Etsy's decision to basically strengthen its approach to mature content on the platform. So Etsy has long been a place where you can buy adult toys. I haven't done it myself, I will say that. But
caveat, Ben.
I know people will be thinking it. You can buy sex toys, you can buy adult imagery. It doesn't veer into pornography, but you can buy kind of explicit items and images on the platform. Has always allowed that. There's been a policy in place for that, and sellers have had to tag the items that they're selling with mature and basically kind of go through an upload process to ensure that users of the platform can filter it out if needs be. This has changed in the last few weeks, and this will now not be possible at all for sellers. So the platform is going to do three things. It's going to limit adult toys and sexual accessories. It's going to prohibit items that depict sex acts and genitalia. And it's going to introduce stricter criteria for listing images that feature mature content. And this hasn't gone down very well at all. So The Guardian wrote a piece, having talked to sellers on the platform, who have basically said that this is a kind of massive reversal in Etsy's policy. One of them said that it was a lazy solution to the problems of non-compliance and non-enforcement that you, as in Etsy, created in the first place. It's a big shift in policy for Etsy. We don't necessarily know the reasons kind of why. Etsy hasn't performed hugely well. Last year, had to make a number of layoffs within the company, I think about 250, if I remember rightly. And so this might be a result of that financial pressure, as you talked about, Dominique. From a policy perspective, from somebody who has had to kind of wrangle with policies in the past, had to make big shifts in policy, what do you think when you see something like this?
I think sort of as you mentioned there, Ben, there's probably a lot more going on behind the scenes. And I think with policy and decisions like this, there's often a number of things in play, and striking the right balance at any one time is important. And I think what's not clear to me from this story, as you've already identified, is what's driven this shift necessarily.
Yeah.
Is it regulation? Is it regulatory pressure? We don't know. Is it internal resourcing pressure to actually deal with the content? We don't know.
Yeah.
For the financial pressure of moderating, enforcing, it's probably takes a while to get through these sorts of reports. It's very manual. Could be that.
Yeah.
So there's always like a number of considerations, and I think on this one, it's not crystal to me.
Yeah, it's a strange one, isn't it? What they have said is that it will take effect at the end of July on the 29th. It's about what it calls maintaining its position as the destination for truly special creative goods. I mean, you could argue that.
No pun intended.
Yeah. Special creative goods are, as a subjective thing, may or may not include sex toys. So
Yeah.
it is an interesting thing, and I'll be interested to see if there's any further fallout from sellers on Etsy as to this policy, because it is a bit of a shift. But interesting to note, and really helpful to get your take on that as well, as we have done throughout the podcast. Thank you very much for joining us. How have you found it before we wrap up today?
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Is my biggest thing to say. I've really enjoyed it, Ben. This podcast, Ctrl-Alt-Speech, is my go-to every week, as is Everything in Moderation. The newsletter, it's something that I share with my team every week too. So it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to be part of it. So thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for taking the time, for giving your insights, for joining in Mike's stead. Mike will be back next week. So we probably won't be talking about EU or the UK election or football quite as much, I would guess. Soccer for our US friends. Yeah, great to speak to you, Dominique. Thank you very much for joining. If you enjoyed today's podcast, rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll speak to you next week. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. This podcast is produced with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund, a fiscally sponsored multi-donor fund at global impact that supports charitable activities to build a more robust, capable, and inclusive trust and safety ecosystem.